Did you know about Rabbinic Judaism and where it started? Let's talk about it. Good morning and welcome to this episode of Did You Know? I'm your host, Rabbi Ira Brower, the Rabbi of Shalom Boca Messianic Synagogue here in Boca Raton, Florida. And today I'm going to talk about the origins of Rabbinic Judaism, where it is, what is it, where it started, and how it affects the Jewish world today. And so maybe you're familiar with that term, Rabbinic Judaism. Really, it is the foundation or the authority of Judaism today, of Jewish people around the world. Whether a Jewish person is Orthodox, meaning religious, or not, secular maybe, Rabbinic Judaism, the traditions that have evolved over the years through the teachings and commentaries and so on, are really established as the foundation of modern Judaism. However, for us that are followers of Yeshua in the Messianic world, while we do honor many of the traditions and many of the teachings of the rabbis that have come over the ages, we hold to a different standard, which is rooted in the scriptures and in the teachings of Yeshua. He is our rabbinic authority, so to speak. But yet we still honor the traditions that are practiced today. We practice many of those in our congregation as well. But I want to talk about a little bit how these traditions and the authority of the rabbis had evolved. If we go back in time to the time of the exile, the first exile, in Babylon in 586, 70 years, 436 return. There were a couple of different returns and so on. And that begins what we call the Second Temple period. So under Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel and others, they came back. So the exiles in Babylon came back by a decree of the king of Persia, Cyrus, and rebuilt Jerusalem, rebuilt the temple, and that begins the period of the Second Temple. But the temple was before, under the First Temple, Solomon, and now the Second Temple, always the focus of Jewish life. Why do I say that? Well, because it was where the temple, where the sacrifices were to be brought to the temple, whether it was the daily sacrifices, the Shabbat sacrifices, the special holiday sacrifices, or most importantly, the Yom Kippur sacrifices, the Day of Atonement. And that was the focus. That's where people came to bring their offerings. That's where people congregated as well. There were various sections of the temple and so on. And during, let's fast forward to the first century time, the time of Yeshua. At that time, there were different sects of Judaism, all within, let's say, the household of Israel. Okay, there were the Pharisees, where most people are familiar with. There were the Sadducees that pretty much controlled the temple operation. They were the elites. They were the priests, the Levites, and so on. But there were other groups. There were the Essenes. There were the Zealots. But even within the Pharisees, who were kind of the mainstream of Judaism at the time, there were different schools. And Yeshua comes into that scene within the framework of Judaism. He wasn't an outsider that came in and disrupted things. While he was a disruptor, but he was a disruptor from within, meaning that he brought into the discussions of the time different interpretations. Sometimes he agreed with one school, For instance, there were two main schools of Rabbinic Judaism at the time, School of Hillel, School of Shammai. School of Hillel was a little more liberal and open-minded to different interpretations of the Torah, while School of Shammai was more strict, but there were other schools as well. And within that context of what was called the oral law, it was oral because it was exactly that. And we talked about this in previous episodes as well, that the oral law was intended, had good intentions. It was intended to help the people to apply the Torah to everyday life. For instance, in the Torah, it says, keep the Sabbath day holy, do no work. Okay, well, what is work? Well, back in Moses' day, when the instruction of that law was given, pretty much it was don't gather wood, because that was work, and there were a few other things, but mainly it was left open. So over time, the discussion was, okay, what is work, and more or less. And so then the issue of healing on the Shabbat in Yeshua's day, is that work or is not work? And to some it was, in others it wasn't. And Yeshua confounds their teaching of the ones who said, no, that's work on Shabbat. How can you heal? And he says, well, don't you pull your ox out of the ditch? That was accepted. That was agreed upon as legitimate to save the life of the ox as a means of livelihood and so on. And Yeshua turns the table on them and says, okay, if that's permissible, what about a man? Isn't it okay then to bring a life of a human healing and so on? And he confounds them in this way. Another really good example of how Yeshua enters into this dialogue is found in Mark chapter 7. I'll just read a few verses and kind of just give a summary of it because it's kind of a long passage. It says this, now the Pharisees, I'm reading from Mark chapter 7, verse 1, the Pharisees and some of the Torah scholars who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua. And they saw that some of his disciples were eating bread with unclean hands, that is, not washed. And then parenthetically it says this, for the Pharisees and all the Jewish people do not eat unless they wash their hands up to the elbow, keeping the tradition of the elders. Notice there's a distinction there between what is considered clean food, per se, back to Leviticus, but now this is a tradition of how to purify yourself before you eat. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they perform a ritual washing. There are many other traditions that they have received and hold, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, copper, and copper vessels. In other words, all these things were traditions. And maybe you could say, well, it makes sense. They're logical. If you come from the marketplace, you don't want to eat. The hands might be dirty and so on. And then it says this, the Pharisees and Torah scholars question Yeshua, why don't your disciples walk according to the tradition of the elders? Why do they eat bread with unwashed hands? So the tradition had developed that if you ate bread or other food, that would have been considered kosher on its own, but if you eat those things with unwashed hands, then that food became not clean, and therefore you're violating the Torah. So then he said to them, rightly did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written. Now he quotes from Isaiah, the people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So here Yeshua puts in proper perspective. He's not saying the traditions or the rules that they set up were wrong in themselves, but when they now have equal or even exceed the importance of God's commandments, then that was wrong. And he points out their hypocrisy in that, replacing the commandments of God with the traditions of men. And then it goes on to continue with some other hypocrisy that he points out to them in the command, observing the command to honor their father and mother and so on. But I want to drop down where his disciples question, what are you talking about? Why is that important about the parable that he said? And then back in verse 18, he said to them, are you then also lacking understanding? Now talking to his disciples. Don't you grasp that whatever goes into the man cannot make him unholy? For it does not enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and then goes out into the sewer, cleansing all foods. Okay? So from that passage, some interpreters later interpreted that to mean that Yeshua now was declaring all things to be clean, all foods clean, disavowing the kosher laws. But that was not the point of what he was saying here. Verse 20, and he continued, it is what comes out of the man that makes the man unholy. For from within, out of the heart of men, come evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within and make the man unholy. So, the point being that at this point, the oral law in many ways had superseded or even replaced what God's intention in the original commandments were. And Yeshua points out the hypocrisy of them. In other words, yes, the kosher laws, what we eat, are still valid, but those are not the most important things. Those are just external external practices, let's say, right? But what's more important, and Yeshua always did this, he took what the commandment was and made it even more significant by pointing out the issues of the heart. So in other words, it's not what you eat that defiles a man, but what is in your heart, what comes out of your heart, the evil that's in man's heart. Similar to what he said earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, right? When he talks about murder, he talks about lust. Those things were forbidden. But he said, you've already committed murder if you have hatred in your heart. And you've already committed adultery if you have lust in your heart. See? So he always brought it back to the conditions and the issues of the heart. But the rabbis, the Pharisees, right, they didn't take kindly to this rebuke to them. And of course, they build a case of how he had blasphemed and so on. But back to this idea of what is Rabbinic Judaism, that it flows from there. We could go back to this time, the first century, where still the teachings of the rabbis were oral, just that. But then fast forward to 70 AD. The temple is destroyed, and the center of Jewish life now is no longer there. The sacrificial system and all of that was, which was where they went for atonement, which was where they went to receive forgiveness from sin and so on. And now the rabbis had a problem. So for the Jewish people that had not accepted Yeshua as the ultimate atonement, okay, so there's a 40-year gap between the time of Yeshua, approximately 30 AD, 33, when his death, burial, and resurrection takes place. 40 years later, 70 or so, is when the temple is destroyed. And the rabbis, the Pharisees, many of them go to a different town called Yavneh, and under the leadership of a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, they develop a new system of Judaism. So instead of the system of the blood, it was required for the forgiveness of sin. No more sacrifices. They couldn't just make sacrifices wherever they were because it had to be in Jerusalem, the place that God had designated. Now, new system. What is the new system? Through prayer, through good deeds, and through charity, the judgment could be averted. And so over time, over the next 40 or 50 years, the oral law became written down, became the basis of what's called the Mishnah, which were written oral laws that the rabbis developed during this period, first, second centuries, let's say. And it became codified, it became written. And then over the next couple of centuries, the Mishnah was added to, and then over the next couple hundred years after that, there were the commentaries on the Mishnah, which was called the Gemara, and there were different rabbinic leaders during these times, and what was contained in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which together form what we call the Talmud. They were interpretations, commentaries on the Torah. There were stories, there were debates, there were just all kinds of different writings. But one thing that we believe is that they were still just interpretations and commentaries of man, and they do not supersede or have the weight of the written word of God. However, over time, they became equal in the Jewish view, for the most part. The Talmud becomes equal to the written word of God, to the Torah, to the prophets, to the writings. And the rabbis are the authority of them. So even today, while maybe only 10 or 15% of the Jewish population, at least in America, it's probably higher in Israel, are what we call Orthodox, hold to practice religious activity, observing Shabbat strictly and kosher laws and so on that were developed by the rabbis. Even secular Jews will still honor the rabbis as the authority when it comes to Jewish life or Jewish laws and so on. So even today, if we talk to a Jewish person, and this I've heard this many times, about whether Yeshua could be the Messiah, oftentimes the reaction is, oh, I need to talk to my rabbi and check with my rabbi. And I've heard many stories of other Jewish believers who, when they first came to faith, maybe they were young and their parents said, oh, we need to take you to the rabbi, because the rabbi is the one that really is going to, show you the truth that Jesus can't be the Messiah, that he's not the Messiah. And oftentimes that conversation boils down to where the rabbi is like, okay, well, if that's what you want to believe, because the evidence of Yeshua being the Messiah is so overwhelming in the Tanakh that it's very difficult to just say, well, for 2,000 years, rabbis have rejected his claim to be the Messiah, so that's the evidence. And so because they don't believe it, you shouldn't believe it either, which really makes no sense at all. However, I would have to say from my own life, growing up, I grew up in that world of Orthodox Judaism, that Jesus was was not the Messiah. And whatever you believed about who he might be or who he will be, Jesus wasn't him. Of course, as I was confronted with the evidence from the Torah, from the prophets, from the writings of who the Messiah would be, what he would do, where he would come from, what tribe he would come from, and all these pieces of the puzzle. And when I put them together, I came to the definite conclusion that the rabbis are wrong, that what I was taught growing up was not true, that he is the Messiah based on the evidence of the Tanakh. And even many of the rabbinic interpretations way back really support the idea that Yeshua is the Messiah, without getting into all the details about that. But during the Second Temple period time, before Yeshua came, many of the rabbinic writings and commentaries through that time support the notion that he fulfilled all those as well. And whether it's in the Orthodox world, the conservative Jewish world, the Reformed Jewish world, the Reconstructionist Jewish world, the Hasidic Jewish world, or any of the other sects, the Chabad, and so on, they all go to the rabbinic authorities for their life and for what they believe in. Our authority is a different rabbi. Our authority is Rabbi Yeshua, who precedes the modern rabbinic Judaism, right? Messianic Jewish life, Messianic Judaism, and the belief in Yeshua as the master, as the rabbi, precedes what today modern Judaism follows. So I'll conclude it there, and hopefully this maybe raises some questions for you. Feel free to post those questions or comments in the description, and feel free to like, comment, and share. And we want to enter into the discussion with you, so feel free to do that. Thank you for watching today. God bless. Hey there, thank you for tuning into our podcast. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And buy me a cup of coffee. $5, $10, $15 a month. The link is in the description.